class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing who could be the San Jose Sharks' next head coach. This is a difficult question to ask because even though many people talk about the coaching carousel of the NHL, how teams constantly recycle the same names over and over again, there is a pretty long list of those same names, especially since every once in a while a team will reach into the AHL or wherever, pick a coach out of that league, bring them into the coaching carousel, which means there could easily be a list of 10, 15, 20 plus names that Mike Grier is going to have to go through a lengthy interviewing process to see if they are the correct fit for the team. David Quinn was fired a few weeks ago, and we have still yet heard much word about who could actually be that primary candidate. So for this video, I will be discussing 5 people in particular, but it is not necessarily a guarantee that any of them will actually end up getting the job. Instead, I've decided to highlight these 5 people because they are coming from different types of positions around the head coaching world in the NHL and just the general hockey leagues around the world, and they could all be decent enough fits for the job. So let us start off with Sheldon Keefe, one of the bigger names in the coaching sphere at this point, just because he was the head coach of the Toronto Maple Leafs, one of the most talked about teams, but also because he was one of the longest tenured head coaches at the time of his firing, which is quite impressive considering how much turnover there is in the head coaching role at the NHL level, because teams are somewhat handcuffed by the salary cap and just generally actually being able to move players. One of the easiest changes that a GM can do to create some change in their organization is simply just by firing the head coach. Over the last year, 18 people were fired from the head coaching job, which is just an absurd amount, but Keefe managed to hang on to his job for multiple years, which is made even more impressive by the fact that Toronto is an extremely volatile market when it comes to their hockey team. So Keefe actually managing to lock down that job and keep the favor of some of the Toronto media that is a bit more rabid is rather impressive. In terms of the good things that Keefe can bring to the San Jose Sharks, he has had immense success in the regular season with the Toronto Maple Leafs, constantly managing to make the playoffs, managing to finish top 3 in their division, and just generally looking rather good and rather effective in that regular season. On top of that, Sheldon Keefe has also helped progress the development of players like Matthews, Marner, and Nylander. Remember, when he originally took the head coaching job, those players had only been playing in the NHL for a couple of years at that point. So he has certainly helped them become the players that they are today, which is a similar thing that he could do with some of the Sharks' younger players that they are likely going to have inserted into the lineup over these next couple of seasons. On the bad news side of things, first of all, Keefe has struggled in the playoffs, as is extremely well known how much the Toronto Maple Leafs have had issues with the postseason over the past couple of decades, but specifically with Sheldon Keefe, they've never managed to get past the first round except one time where they got to the second round and immediately lost in 5 games to the Florida Panthers. On the other side of things, it's not as though the Sharks are necessarily going to be looking to be a playoff team over these next couple of years, so that's not necessarily that bad of a situation, but it still remains to be said that that is a potential weakness for Sheldon Keefe. But on top of that, Keefe is not necessarily a coach who has been used to a lot of losing. He has been with the Toronto Maple Leafs for the past few years. They have had a lot of success in the regular season, and even prior to that, when he was an AHL coach, he was with the Toronto Marlies, where they was also making impact in their respective postseasons. In fact, he actually won a Calder Cup with the Marlies. So if inserted into the San Jose Sharks situation, where they're likely not going to be as bad as last season, but probably still near the basement of the league, will he be able to adapt to that particular spot? That is a major question mark. But it should also be noted that hiring a head coach is not a one-way thing. This is not like an NHL draft where you can just pick a player and they're forced to now come into your organization. Sheldon Keefe would have to decide to sign with the San Jose Sharks as well, and considering his history over the past few seasons with the Toronto Maple Leafs, he might be looking to try and get another crack at the playoffs with a team that is closer than San Jose, so it might be a bit of a long shot to actually pick him up. A coach who might actually fit the mold of the San Jose Sharks a bit better would be Don Granado, former head coach of the Buffalo Sabres. He took over in Buffalo a few years ago, then managed to actually kind of be on the up and up over the next couple of seasons, which made people think that Buffalo would manage to finally break that barrier, finally return to the playoffs. But this past season was slightly disappointing for Buffalo, and as as such, he ended up getting fired. But Granado did a lot of very good things with the Buffalo Sabres. The major positive is that not only are the San Jose Sharks in a similar position as the Buffalo Sabres were when Granado was hired, but also the touch that Granado actually managed to have with a lot of those young and talented players in Buffalo is exactly the type of touch that the San Jose Sharks want from their new head coach when it comes to their young and talented players. Looking at Buffalo, players like Dahlin had been struggling for the first couple of years, perhaps not fully living up to his potential, but once Granado was brought in, suddenly Dahlin is looking like one of the better defensemen in the entire league. Owen Power was their first overall pick back in 2021, if I'm not, or I believe it was 2022, if I'm not mistaken, and he has really blossomed into a solid defenseman also under Granado. Tage Thompson with the career 90-plus point season, again with Granado. Jeff Skinner looked completely washed up in his career, looked like just a big contract that was going to waste away with the Buffalo Sabres, but he has been rejuvenated again under the watch of Granado. So these are all players who have managed to have career seasons, just breakout years, strong development seasons with this guy at the helm. And this is exactly what the Sharks are looking for. Like I said, they'll have Will Smith in the lineup perhaps as soon as next year, maybe in a couple of years. Macklin Celebrini, perhaps as soon as next year. Quinton Musty eventually. Philip Biestet. All of these players, you're looking to be able to get them off the ground and running very early on to try and be able to get competitive relatively soon and just generally manage to have them get some success in their career. Granado has shown a particular efficiency at being able to do this, so this could perhaps be a strong choice. The bad news is, of course, the fall off that the Buffalo Sabres did have in his most recent year, the reason he actually ended up getting fired. Some people could attribute that to the Buffalo Sabres players themselves, perhaps just not being able to actually maintain that level of play. Maybe they thought things would come too easily to them, and as such they ended up losing, or perhaps other teams just got generally better than Buffalo did over that past year. But at the same time, coaching does need to play a part in that. That could be a bit of an issue, but I'd say there are a lot of positives that could make Granado a really strong candidate. Then we have Jay Woodcroft, another coach with some head coaching NHL experience, and also on top of that, different from the two previous names mentioned, is that he also has some San Jose Sharks experience. Was a head or an assistant coach with the San Jose Sharks back in the early 2000s when Todd McClellan was around as head coach for San Jose. And while there aren't necessarily a ton of players left in the organization, there are still a couple of them who, Logan Couture, of course, as well as Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who are familiar with what Woodcroft brings to a team. On top of that, Woodcroft has had at least a bit of success in the NHL with the Edmonton Oilers, so that is some good news as well. The bad news when it comes to Woodcroft is that he kind of fell off pretty hard this season with Edmonton, and as such didn't actually keep his NHL job for a very long time. He started the season off terribly with what should have been an extremely good Edmonton Oilers roster, as we can see now with his replacement. The fact that they actually lost to the San Jose Sharks this past season is testament to how many issues Woodcroft had, and it was like the moment he was fired, it was a switch flipped in those Edmonton Oilers players that immediately turned them into an actual competitive team, which allowed them to make the playoffs in a particularly favorable spot. So that doesn't necessarily reflect particularly well onto Woodcroft. So while there is that San Jose Shark connection and it could be interesting to bring him back, I don't necessarily know if he is the best candidate. Then we have Ryan Warsofsky as we move into a couple of names who don't have that NHL experience but could definitely become the next head coach. One thing that Warsofsky has that even Woodcroft didn't have is actually recent San Jose Sharks experience. On top, in fact, he was the assistant coach for the San Jose Sharks just this past season, which allows him to actually get past a lot of those introductory steps that a new coach needs to deal with. He'll be able to understand, which players do excel at which areas of the game, which players have issues, who works together well, who clicks, all of these types of things that a coach would generally have to learn over their first few weeks, over their first few months with the team. Warsofsky is already 100% ready to deal with because of the fact that he's been here over this past season under the head coach of David Quinn. Having said that, it is not necessarily the best case scenario for the Sharks to get someone who was so close to the team already last year. It should be noted that while David Quinn may have been fired for performance reasons, considering the Sharks finished dead last in the league, it is probably not a coincidence that this firing happened a few days after the player exit interviews, and I would not be surprised if there were a few players who took issue with what David Quinn actually brought to the table as a head coach. And if those issues actually extended to the Sharks coaching staff as a whole, which means it would include Warsofsky, it might not be best to actually bring him in as well. I imagine if Greer were considering this option, he'd probably have to talk to the players to see if, like, hey, is Warsofsky okay? Are you okay with bringing him in? But I don't know if the players would necessarily be willing to stand in that way, even if they had somewhat of an issue with him. So if the Sharks were actually looking for a completely fresh take on the franchise, Warsofsky would definitely be one of the worst choices. But if they're looking to kind of keep the course slightly, just get a bit of a new voice in the room, he could be a really good choice as well. And then finally, we go quite off board with David Carl. He is not a coach with NHL experience. In fact, he doesn't really have professional league coaching experience either, as he's not an AHL guy. Instead, he has been the head coach of Denver University in the NCAA for the last few years. But one thing that cannot be said about David Carl is that he is a bad coach. He has found immense success at the college level. Over the last 3 seasons, Denver University has won 2 NCAA titles, including this season where they managed to defeat Boston College, the very same Boston College that housed players like Will Smith, San Jose Sharks prospect, as well as Ryan Leonard, Gabe Perreault, Cutter Gauthier. And not only did David Carl's Denver University manage to win that game to get the championship, but they also shut out that team, which shows a particular affinity for the strong game plan that Carl had. On top of that, he was also the head coach for Team USA at the Under-20s World Junior Championships back in January of this year, where he also managed to claim a gold medal. He is a winner at the level that he is currently coaching at. And also, because he's constantly in that World Juniors level, that NCAA level, it is quite clear that he has a particular affinity for being able to coach these younger players, these 19, 20, 21-year-olds who are trying to find their foot in a more put-together league. And David Carl has done a very good job at really rallying those types of players together and getting them on the same page to be able to win. It is not easy to come into a World Juniors tournament where you're getting players from all different walks of life, some junior players, some overseas players, some NCAA players, some USHL type of players, all together, a completely new team, players unfamiliar with each other, getting them on the same page and actually working together is not an easy task. David Carl managed to do that exceptionally well at that tournament, which means he could be a very interesting choice for the San Jose Sharks. Now, the downsides are very obvious. He doesn't have that professional experience, and perhaps playing or coaching in the NHL, he might fold under the pressure and things will just be a bit too much for him. But is it worth a try? Perhaps, as like I said, the only real downside over the next couple of years of getting a bad coach and then just firing him if it doesn't work out is that he would likely harm their development. But in David Carl's case, that doesn't seem like something that would actually possibly happen, considering he is quite good with these younger players. So it might be worth the try, even if it doesn't necessarily lead to actual team success in general. Another thing that could be a bit of a downside is the fact that Carl is relatively young. Warsofsky was pretty young as well, but Carl is even a couple of years younger than that at just 34 years of age, which means he would actually even be younger than a couple of Sharks players, in particular Marc-Edouard Vlasic. Vlasic has been in the league longer than David Carl has even been an adult, and so that's a bit of a weird situation to navigate. Usually that age is able to command a respect in the locker room, so coming in when you're kind of really not all that much older than many of those players, it can be a bit difficult. But it could be worth the try if Mike Greer is indeed willing to take that risk. But that will do it for this video. Like I said, it is very possible that the Sharks end up with a head coach that is not a part of the current group of candidates that I have specifically curated for this video, but definitely a couple of really interesting names. If I had to choose one from this list in particular, I would probably lean a bit towards Don Granado from the Buffalo Sabres. I think he could be a really strong fit for this Sharks team. He knows the type of position the organization is in. He knows the type of players that the Sharks will be getting onto the team over these next couple of seasons. He might be able to navigate it rather well. Class dismissed.